So I have a story of when my children were little and got lost. When AJ was born, we upgraded from a single stroller to a double stroller. And I was very proud of this double stroller. It wasn't a regular one. It was a sit-and stand where you put the infant in the front so you could watch him, and the toddler could either sit at the back or he could stand up and peer over his little brother's head and watch everything that was coming. I thought it was quite nice. And we decided to take it out for a stroll one sunny summer day, and we were walking down Bloor Street in the Annex area. And Shane and I got into a conversation, and we were just talking back and forth. Our children were below us, and all was well in the world. Until I looked down and saw that I was one child short. My sleeping infant was in front of me, but Nolan, who was supposed to be sitting nicely and obedient in the back, had slipped out. Well, panic ensues. He was about 2 years old at this point in time. And I couldn't remember the last time we saw him. I knew we had him when we started. And so Shane took off, and he ran back in the direction that we had just come from. And I decided I was going to just look around, try to get in his mind. Did he go into a store? Did he stop to pet a dog? So I was pushing back quickly, but I wanted to kind of take in everything. And during those few moments, you're uttering prayers in your heart, right? You're just looking, you're hoping for the best, but fearing the worst. Shane reached our son before I did. But thankfully, Toronto is a city full of good Samaritans. And there were 4 adults who had gathered around our son and were protecting him and trying to get information from him. And Shane comes running up to him and he says, "Nolan!" And Nolan, who is about up to my knee at that point in time, was so overwhelmed and just frightened, he didn't say anything. And so the strangers turned to him and bent down and said, "Little boy, is this your daddy? Do you know this man?" And Nolan just stood there. Shane tries to say, "Nolan, it's me, it's Daddy, it's your daddy, Nolan." Strangers start looking at Shane, protecting our son from this man, and Nolan doesn't say anything. Thankfully, I wasn't too far behind. And when I caught up to him, I cry out, "Nolan!" And he just looks at me, bursts into tears, and says, "Mommy." And we embrace. And these wonderful strangers who had stood by our son finally realized that he was in safe hands. Nolan acknowledged his father, and we moved on. What had happened was we had stopped at a traffic light. And while we were waiting for the light to change color, Nolan had slipped off. And when the light changed, we went forward, and he stayed at the light. So we learned some valuable lessons then as a family, including the seatbelt function for a toddler. But when I think of this story of Mary and of losing her son, I always think back to that moment. It was probably less than 5 minutes all told, but for me, it felt like eternity. It was just that heart-sinking, stopping moment of where did he go and what must have happened to him. And I could only imagine what Mary must have felt like as well. But I also think back on the story in regards to this story because I feel for Mary so much in Jesus' reply to her. When she says, "Child, where have you been?" And he said, "Well, didn't you know I would be in my Father's house?" They were going back home. They were supposed to be traveling back to their hometown, to the house that his father, Joseph, provided for him. Joseph, the man who was with Mary through thick and through thin, who took her on to be his wife even though he and the rest of the town knew that this child was not his. Joseph, the man who traveled with her through that journey to Bethlehem 12 years prior, who probably helped birth Jesus into the world himself. Joseph, the one who provided for them, who gave them house and home. Well, wouldn't you know I would be in my Father's house? I feel for Mary in that moment, and I feel for Joseph as well. And the thing is, when we reflect upon this, we can't say that Jesus was just a toddler. Jesus was 12 years old. I mean, he was on the precipice of being considered a man according to Hebrew tradition, but he was still only 12 years old. He hadn't fully hit puberty at this point in time. And Mary and Joseph had trusted him, as they probably were right to do, having made this journey year in and year out. And probably as the years went on, grew a little bit more independent each time. He was 12, and they were with a large group, and there were other kids his age. And they had fully trusted him to walk with the group and to be with his friends. I doubt very much that they left Jerusalem without checking in to make sure that he was actually with them. So at some point, Jesus decided he'd rather not be here. He'd rather be in the temple, and he returned back. For Mary and Joseph, getting to the end of the day and having to look for their son would have been a moment of shame. I mean, as parents, you always find that a little bit, but how would you have to explain to other people, well, my son decided not to come this year? It would have seemed that both Jesus was disobedient and that something was wrong with Mary and Joseph's parenting skills, that they had a son who would blatantly not do what he knew, on top of the worry. And so they go back and they look. And we know that it is 3 days in total. The first day, they're not really worried, but that night they are. And they search a full other day in Jerusalem, a massive city. And they can't find him anywhere, and they go another night, not knowing where their son is or what has happened to their still small boy. Because when you're a parent, your child is still always your child. And it is only on the third day that they find him. And I can imagine Mary, upon seeing him finally in the temple, just all that flood of emotion, the relief and the love and the happiness, and probably mingled with a little bit of anger and frustration and just anguish. Oh my goodness, okay, relief, all coming poured out. She goes to him, but he is sitting and talking to religious men in the holy temple. And Mary, as we know, is a religious woman. And as a good and religious woman, she tempers her language, I feel like, at this point. I feel like her words may have been different if she found him in the marketplace. But she's not going to get too angry in front of him, in a holy place, in front of holy people. So she says, "Did you not know we were anguishing for you?" And then those words again. "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" And I imagine Mary just taking a deep breath as she hears this, looking down, wondering, who is this child? It's not like him, I would imagine her saying the entire time to Joseph. It's not like him to do something like this. It's not in his character. But when she finally finds him and he says this, she looks at him with new eyes. Who is this child? Who is this child that she bore? Who is this child that was proclaimed by the angels, to whom shepherds ran and paid homage to, who dignitaries had come and given gifts to? Who was this child who was now sitting and talking almost as an equal to the holy priests of the temple? Who was this child that the elder Simeon had told her was destined for the falling and rising of many in Israel and would pierce her own soul too with a sword? Those 3 days and 2 nights had indeed felt like there had been a sword piercing through Mary's heart as she searched in anguish. And his words pierced again, and yet they were only a foreshadowing of the future, of another 3 days and 2 nights when she would not have her son by her side. But this time, instead of finding him being lauded and honored by holy people, she would find his name being besmirched and mocked. This is the only scene of Jesus' childhood which we have in the scriptures. It tells both of his intellect as a small child, but also reminds us in part that he was a child. For this, he will be fully obedient to his parents, and he will grow up in stature before God and all men. He will make them proud. This incident wasn't really like him, not part of his character at all. But I wonder if somewhere Mary, reflecting on all that had happened before, knew. And she pondered these things in her heart. Amen.